Hi, I'm DJ Ware. Today on the CyberGizmo, we're going to be taking a look at directory access. And that's better known as LDAP, and we'll talk about that right after this. So LDAP has a lot of history and a lot of things that it can be used for. And today we're gonna take a look at it, kind of explain what it is. I'll put some times in the show notes or in the description below so that you can skip ahead if you already know what LDAP is. There's no point in educating someone that already knows and already has used it. Let's take a look at it. So LDAP, what is it? So it's called the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. It was invented at the University of Michigan, I think back in the early 90s. And it is a subset of the X.500 directory structures or directory protocols. X.500 is huge. I mean, it was implemented back, oh gosh, late 80s, I think, and it was used mainly, was at that time used mainly on mainframes. I only know of one instance of an X.500 implementation here in the US, and it's pretty humongous. It takes quite a bit of work to do an X.500. So LDAP was really designed to simplify and make things a lot easier. LDAP is an open industry standard. It's open software. It's been around for, like I said, since '96. It runs on most platforms. It runs on everything from Linux to Windows to Mac OS to Android, and there are even implementations of it for iOS. LDAP is controlled by the RFC 4511 specification. So there are standards bodies in place to make sure that it interoperates correctly between different systems. Now, that being said, vendors don't always pay attention. Microsoft. Oh, and they kind of they kind of do their own things, which makes it a little difficult to try to integrate sometimes. So what does LDAP do? LDAP commonly is used to provide a one-stop shop for storing of usernames and passwords, certificates, and other identifiable information. You can put address and phone numbers and email addresses in there, and a host of other information that you might need to populate a directory. LDAP, of course, can be used for more than one thing. It can be used as the directory for an email server. You can use it to control website access and being able to, instead of using the .ht password files, you can use LDAP to do that. And it's supported also under Linux by PAM, the pluggable authentication module. So you can use LDAP to actually control sign-ins to the Linux servers if you so desire. The most current version of the protocol, was developed in 1996, and its version 3 has not changed since then. LDAP uses port 389 by default, and that's both. You can use it on both TCP and UDP, and that is unencrypted. So any information you put across that port will be in the clear on your network. Port 636 is reserved. It also works for TCP and UDP, and that's reserved for LDAP over SSL, or LDAP-S is normally what the protocol is, although you don't have to specify LDAP or LDAP-S anymore. It will figure it out. LDAP is not single sign-on by itself, although you can technically do kind of a simplified version of single sign-on. It does provide support for single sign-on. However, it is one of the tools used to enable it, and we'll go through why that is. LDAP supports SSO by using the directory, and you can use LDAP alone for single sign-on, but it's going to be very simplified. And the only way that works is if all the machines that are being controlled by the single sign-on use the same DNS parent. If you use a different parent, like in a large organization, that's not going to work. The directory server authentication and single sign-on refers to using the same credentials for each application. And that is typically how it is used. So applications that require sign-ons, they'll use LDAP to manage the users, and so that each application doesn't have to track authentication between all those different things. It allows them, excuse me, to standardize their access to it. However, the LDAP directory must contain credentials for that to work, at least for the initial authentication. So there has to be some mechanism in there that the applications use to recognize that this user is allowed access to this application. And usually that will be some problems. That'll cause some problems. And so I hate this term. I really do. It's called reduced sign-on. And that refers to businesses simply saying that, hey, not all of our applications are going to work using single sign-on. You may get challenged for a password or a user ID or a certificate or something in order to gain access. And it's just because those applications are either too old or on infrastructure that doesn't support LDAP or doesn't support the other identity management systems used to implement them. Now the big dog, the auth and auth. Auth and auth is authentication and authorization. Single sign-ons you usually have to have more than just an authentication. You have to have some form of authorization as well. And single sign-on can also be used in order to make it a little bit more secure. You can combine smart cards and other one-time password tokens in order to make sure that user, it's something I know and something I have is usually the security mechanisms that are used. So something you know is your password and something you have is the token or the card. Authorization is needed as part of least privilege. In other words, I'm not going to just carte blanche give the user full access to the systems. I certainly may not want them into payroll and maybe into accounts payable systems. I might want to control access to those. And so you would grant the user access to the applications based on their need to know or what they have to do their jobs. Authorization is usually supported through LDAP groups or discretionary access protocols or third-party applications. And those third-party are usually part of a suite called identity management. Red Hat, for example, has available something called IDM, Identity Management System, that provides the extra layers of authorization that you would need in order to be able to accomplish that. Sometimes they're larger. They use PKI infrastructures. Some use Kerberos in order to be able to further the authorization status so that keys are exchanged between the applications. And if you have the right credentials, you're allowed access. And if you don't, you're denied, for example. So how does it work? So simply, LDAP is just basically a database. It has a front end that interfaces it to the network, and then a back end, a database, which is used to store information. LDAP uses a file format called LDIF, or the LDAP Data Interchange Format. This is a format that's been around a long time. It is used to exchange data between LDAPs. It's used to exchange data between LDAPs and Active Directory. And it also allows you to set up an LDAP for the first time. Yes, there are applications you can use that are GUIs. There's PHP LDAP admin, which allows you to go in and change things within the LDAP directory, and that's perfectly okay too, as long as you don't expose that to the internet. LDIFs are just plain text files. They have a name-value pair, and that represents data to the LDAP server. It will read the file. LDAP, when you import it, it'll read the file. It'll check it according to its syntax, and if everything's good, it writes the data out to the disk, and it's available to you through the LDAP utilities. Here's an example of one. There's a couple things on here I want to kind of stress. I don't know if my mouse shows up. It doesn't. So on the left, there's three groups. There's the DN people, DNOU groups, and then there's CN minors groups, and then some other stuff called a posixGroup. Those three things are establishing just the group levels within LDAP. LDAP is basically a hierarchy. So you start with a group, and then you can train down through one or more groups, and then you would have users that are assigned to that group. So you would basically have a tree that goes down to assign users to their appropriate places. The fourth DN at the bottom there is the actual user ID. And that user, which is user ID equals John, those are that variable UID, that's defined based on the object class, which is the next three things here on the right-hand side. You have inetOrgPerson, which is a standard for the kinds of information you would need in internet apps. You have the posixAccount that's used by PAM, for example. You have to have that if you want to be able to allow access through PAM. And then the shadowAccount has the equivalent basically of the Linux shadow file, as well as some permission controls and access controls in there to allow access or to create flags, if you will, for access that user would be entitled to use. And then the applications would use that data to either accept or deny entry. SN is the surname. Now, a couple of things. A lot of these are, you don't know from this list which ones these are. So let me show you what you can find here. Let me just flip over here. There is a site that is called the LDAP Wiki, and it's just simply ldapwiki.com. And you can do a search and bring up the different directories. And as you'll see, it'll tell you what you have to have in the directory, which is there's nothing required here. And then what things are optional to be in that directory. And as you can see, there are just all kinds of things that are in here. But one of the things that I would caution you is that it's up to the vendors to determine whether or not they're going to support parts of this or extend it, however they want to do it. You may run into situations where one vendor supports the inetOrgPerson's schemas that have this set of fields, and you might find some that don't. So if you're using an LDAP server, it's best to keep them all under the same vendor, just so that you have compatibility going forward. So let's come back to this for a second, but that gives you some idea where to find that. And then some of this information down here this would be the actual user ID. This would be equivalent to a Linux user ID. And then there is a group number and a group ID that is equivalent as well to Unix. It's generally good form that when you're using LDAP to distinguish it from local users, this is just a convention, is that you pick a number that's high enough that it doesn't interfere with accounts that are local to the machine. So that somebody looking at the box sees someone signed in as a 10,000 account and above, that they would be assigned to the LDAP, and then people would know that. But again, that's just a convention. It's not a rule. And then the user password. This one is, because we are adding it, it is unencrypted. So just to let you know that there is some ways that you can do that. You can leave that field off, and then you can come back and do an LDAP password, and that would be encrypted when it was set up. So a couple of different ways you can do that. But for today, just what we're doing is fine. Gecos, this is kind of an obsolete method. It was used for GE operating systems, or better known as God's only operating system. This goes way back even before Unix. And the reason why it's even in here is because Bell Labs had a printer that the only printer they had available to them was on a GE server, and so they had to have some way to be able to pass the sign on to get to use the printer in their department. So anyway, that's why it's there. I don't know why it's still there, but it is. What login shell you want the user to use, and then finally the home directory. And we're going to change that. I want to make this in line with Linux so that we don't have some weird thing going on where we have all of our home directories assigned under LDAP. Now, again, if you want to do that, that's up to you. You can configure this any way that you want, or set it up any way that you want. So one of the things, just to recap, a couple things. User ID John is a member of the group people. And John has 3 different schemas that are used to make up his directory information. And that allows access as a directory, allows access to PAM, and allows access to the passwords that Unix would use. And one of the other things that you can do here is that this user would appear on the system. I mean, it's not going to appear in the password file, and it's not going to be in the group file, and it's not going to have an entry in the shadow file. So sudos will work, but you have to assign them you have to have that user assigned to a group on the local machine, such as wheel or sudo or something, in order for it to be able to work. At least I don't know. I think you could also go in and individually assign the users if you want to, and that will work as well. I have done that. So I'm going to just kind of step through what we're going to do today, and then we'll actually go and try this out. So the first thing we would need to do, of course, is update our packages, and then we'll want to install 2 different packages, and this is going to be the same usually for almost all Linux versions that I've encountered, is that you'll install slapd, and you may need to install LDAP utils-utils. You may not. Some systems come with it already installed, some don't. So I just put it in there, and if it needs it, it'll take it, and if not, it'll just tell you it's already got it. In our example, you'll want to change your host name in the etc/hostname file. Just use name.example.com for today, and that will allow the installation process to actually do this. Actually, I have this backwards. You should change your machine and reboot it first before you actually install, because what's going to happen is during the LDAP, the slapd install, it's going to create the admin account, and the admin account is going to have a designation for the DC groups being assigned to example, and another one being assigned to .com or just com. And so you'll want to have that ahead of time before you want to have your machine defined. Otherwise, it's not going to create the DCs correctly. And you need that because, remember, LDAP is a tree structure, and that is the top-level trees. So then we'll do a checkout. We'll do an LDAP search. The -X says to not use the SAML insertion in order to grant access to the server. And so you, in a production environment, you would disable that -X. You would not have that on. You would want to have it using SAML and having the signatures encrypted before it allows access. So the -LLL is to return the output in LDIF format, and the other 2 additional L's basically format it a little bit better, and remove some of the junk fields that you really don't want to see. The -H is the URL to the LDAP server, and for this case, it's LDAP : and 3 slashes. That's equivalent to a local host. And of course, that would be using port 389. The -B is the base search, and we're giving it DC = example, DC = com. If you're using a different machine name for a fully qualified machine, you'll need to change that in order to get access to get it to return anything. And then you're asking it to return the DN, so it will come back correctly. In my case, if I do this on my machine, nothing's going to be returned because I have a fully qualified domain name with mac.info, macknife.info. So I would have to change my search path in order for it to work. So the LDAP server should reply with the DN DC = example, DC = com, and it should also give you the admin username, which would also be CN = admin, and then it has the DC = example, DC com. That's the, if you read this right to left, that's the top-level tree, the com, then example is the next level, and then the user ID is below that. So next, to populate the database with the LDAP, and I'll put this LDIF file up on my GitHub page so that you can retrieve it from there. There are other places on the internet. This is a common one that's used in testing. So there's other places to find add content.ldif. You can do a search for it and find it. Again, what we're going to do here is we're actually going to write the contents. We're going to read the file. We're going to write the contents to the directory, and we use the LDAP add command to do that. And that will prompt you for the admin password. This is the same password you gave to the slapd server when you installed it. So make sure you remember what that is. And then you should see it adding the people group and then the entries for the group and the minors and the UID coming from the add content.ldif. Then you can turn around and test it. And so this test is actually saying We want to do a search on the directory, and this time we're going to start with a key that says UID equals John. So we don't want to see anything else. We just want it to return that one. And we only want two specific fields, CN and the group ID number. So we'll ask so we'll send that, and then we should see a reply that says CN UID equals John, OU is people, DC example, DC com. And then it should show you the CN name and then the group ID number, which is in this case 500. And so next time what we'll do is when we're continuing this, we'll set up the LDAP servers to use SSL protocols. But for today, we're just going to do this simple. Again, that's why I always do things is let's start from the ground up instead of making it difficult to understand to begin with. So I have a really small machine. I want to use a Raspberry Pi 3. And you can, if you're doing this for home use, you can easily get up to, 20 users. I don't know how many people have families that big, but you can easily get up to 20 users on a Raspberry Pi. LDAP has a number of ways to be configured. There's so many ways, in fact, that it is designed to be scalable. In one instance, we had almost 150,000 users in a directory. And what we did was since we didn't want everyone to be able to log into applications at each site, we had, I think there was 21 sites across the world. And since we didn't want to just blanket access to all of those, to all systems, we kept individual LDAP servers at each site, and then we used replication to move a group that was allowed access to all of them. And then the nice thing about that is sometimes users would transfer from one area to another, and they would become members of a different LDAP group, and so it was easy to drop them off one and add them to another without a big deal. It was just a matter of moving the entry from one to another on the servers. Also, it was possible for users that were remote to be able to access applications if they had a need to do that. So again, it was easy to do that kind of work. So you can also set up LDAP to be in a load balance configuration. So if you have one massive LDAP and you're wanting to be able to control access to it on a large scale basis, you can do that through load balancing. There's also replication failover available in LDAP, where one LDAP server keeps a mirror of the other. In the event of that LDAP crashing, it would, if your DNS is set up correctly, it would automatically fail over to the other working server until you could figure out what was going on with the one that crashed. One other point about LDAP: you design LDAPs for the peak traffic, not for the average. And the reason for that is very simply this. Users sign on almost all the time at the same time in the morning. They go to lunch at the same time. They come back from lunch at the same time. And so LDAP servers are going to get hammered according to the time zone that you're in. It's funny, but that's just the way it works. I mean, people don't just trickle into LDAP servers. If your start time on your business is 8 o'clock, you're going to get a massive surge in sign-ons. If your lunch periods run from 12 to 1, same problem. At 1 o'clock, you're going to get another massive surge of people signing back onto the system. So just be aware that you don't do LDAP by average. You do it by peak. At least that's been my experience anyway. So let's get started. Let's do it. Let's do this. Hopefully you can see my screen. And we'll start out by checking my host name. Now mine's going to be different because, like I said, I have node 5 macknife.info. Now I'm going to have to change my add content file in order to match this, or I could change my host name temporarily to be example.com. Now, one other thing I need to tell you, example.com is kind of a placeholder DNS entry. It's used for testing. It's owned by the INA. And so you can use that for any kind of internal LDAP directory or DNS name. It's fine. The only problem with it is don't put it on the internet because they have restrictions in it. They don't allow any kind of host additions or deletions. They don't allow any modifications to the DNS protocol. It's there for your use, for internal use. So it is not a real DNS entry. It is reserved away, and you can't get in trouble for using it as long as you're not trying to modify the internet version. But if you're just using it internally, it's fine. You can do that. So just with that said, you can do who is on it. You can actually look up the rules on it if you want. So let's go ahead and I'm going to do a slap D and LDAP utils. I think that's in, this is like I said, a Raspberry Pi 3, and I think LDAP utils are, yeah, they're already installed with the base operating system, and that's going to happen a lot of times. So now it's asking me to set up my admin password for the base LDAP entry. So we'll put in a super secure password and remember it. There is a way to recover it, but it is painful, very painful. Should you have to do that. But probably the easiest, well, if you did a reconfig, you'd blow your directory away. So be very careful with that. All right, so we're all good to go there. So the next thing we want to do is we want to do a test and make sure that it's working. So let's do that. Remember, -X bypasses the SSO sign-on. So this is basically saying I'm signing on as an anonymous user. And again, in production, you would disable that. So don't put this out on the internet. Now, I'm changing mine to agree to my system because that's probably where it, no. Did I boo-boo? Let's try a UID equal admin. I'm looking to see if I made a mistake. I'm sure. Oh, I know what I did. I forgot the comma. There. Works better when you get the syntax right. Yeah, it's just like a database where you have to have commas in between the fields. You probably saw that before I did. Oh, anyway, so there's the response, and it's given me my DN class, my top object, which is always the DC object, organization. And then it's showing me the group that it's created, DN Mac DC info. And then this is the simple security object, and then we have the CN admin and so forth, and then this is identified as the LDAP administrator. So our system is working. So the next thing we want to do is we're going to actually do an LDAP add, but before we do that, I'm going to change this . So I don't screw up another one. I was probably okay with the Mac knife, but I'm sure I'd probably ended up screwing something up here. So that looks good. And I have changed the home directory already to home/John from the LDAP. So we should be all good to go. I'm going to use the LDAP command add. Same thing, use the -X. And CN this is defining my administrative account. You'll use example. I'm using my fully qualified domain name. And then this identifies the file. Make sure, yeah. So it's going to ask me for my admin password, and then I should get 3 entries back, or 4 entries back, that it's added people and groups and minors and John. So if that looks good, and so we will now try the ultimate test to see if I can search the LDAP for the user I just created. This is going to be very similar. And then I'll put my search string, which is UID John. And this is the information I want back. I want the group ID number and I want the CN. There we go. So we have a working LDAP. I have my, my DN came back, that John is a member of the group people. I have a CN of John Doe, and I have a group number of 10,000. 10,000 is, if you look in here, it's nothing magic. Oops. You'll notice right here the group ID number is 10,000. I always set those up so that I don't have collisions. If I've got that many groups on a system, I probably have a serious problem with my organizational structure. So, as always, I hope you enjoyed this talk today. And if there's anything that you'd like to see in the future, remember, I'm going to come back and there's 2 more things to do. I'll put the SSL encryption on the server, and then set up the client for to allow us to gain access through the directory instead of having to set up users on every system. And that's really a nice advantage, is that you don't, once you set up the LDAP connections to PAM, you don't have to add users to the system. And if you do password changes, you just password change the LDAP server. You don't have to go back to all those servers again and do that. So again, as always, it's hope that you enjoyed this. And if you did, please like and subscribe, and hope to see you all again real soon. And bye for now.